Our next speaker holds a PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and is currently a professor of political science at Georgia State University. His research examines issues of international security, focusing on questions of strategy and statecraft on the brink of war. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel Altman.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm here today to talk about the fait accompli, what it is, what history tells us about it, and why this single strategy is such an important part of the threats we confront now and in the future from China and Russia. Let me start with two quick examples so that we're all clear what we mean. In 2014, we saw thousands of Russian troops, thinly disguised as green men, invade, seize, occupy Crimea, and a few weeks later, we saw Putin formally annex it, as you see here. Now, importantly, Russia's strategy here was not to defeat the Ukrainian military. It was not to use diplomatic threats to get Ukraine to concede, and of course, Ukraine still rejects Russian control over Crimea. Instead, it was simply to take Crimea, right? That's crucial. That's what makes this sort of strategy distinct, and it was a calculated gamble that Moscow could get away with taking Crimea without provoking war with either Ukraine or NATO, and that gamble succeeded. Somewhat similarly is the case we saw less than 2 years ago between India and China. You see Prime Minister Modi here, but we saw Chinese forces in Ladakh advance forward in multiple areas across the line of actual control, seizing territory that India, of course, regards as its own. Again, initially bloodless. There was one clash at Galwan Valley that killed 20 Indian soldiers and 4 Chinese soldiers. But on the whole, the idea was to move not where Indian troops were present or needed to be dislodged, but to move into places maybe they'd just been patrolling. And some of those areas are still held by China today, right? So again, at least a partial success. These are examples of the fait accompli as a strategy. Right, so here's my definition. Broadly, this translates into English as accomplished fact. So the idea is to just sort of make something an accomplished fact. If you've heard that it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission, that's sort of what we're talking about here. I start the definition with imposing. Usually we're talking about taking, right? Taking a piece of territory, and I'll focus mostly on taking territory today. But I want to use the word imposing, which is a little more general, to include some other things. Like, for example, China took islands in the Spratlys in the 1980s and 90s, but since then they've reclaimed land to expand those islands. I would still consider that a fait accompli, if a smaller one. A more important, perhaps, example historically is that the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, began with a Soviet fait accompli to deploy medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles to Cuba, right? And just sort of have Washington wake up one day, realize they're there and operational, and be forced to accept that sort of bitter reality. Obviously, they were discovered before then, and things didn't work out that way, but that was the strategy, right? It was still a fait accompli. So what are some of the key characteristics? This is to some extent, right, this is obviously a military strategy. It's often about deploying military forces to seize territory. It often is bloody. It can be bloodless, but it is definitely not by definition bloodless. But still, the intent, and I do think this is foundational to the strategy and what makes it different from other strategies, is in some sense to avoid war, or to avoid a larger war, right? This is about getting away with taking something or imposing something. So on the one hand, you are trying to avoid war. Maybe you even expect to avoid war if you're the aggressor. But on the other hand, there is this calculated risk of war. And indeed, I will show you some data showing that the specific sequence of events of a miscalculated belief you can get away with seizing a piece of territory where the other side isn't willing to let it go, that is a major cause of modern war. It is one of the leading causes, I would argue, of war in recent decades. So importantly, with the fait accompli, gains are imposed. They're not received as concessions. And this is important because coercion, sort of threat-making ultimatums are hard. We've seen sort of Putin's demands towards NATO go unfulfilled. And in general, what research tells us is that sanctions don't work very well. Diplomatic threats don't work very well. Even bombing country cities to try to get them to submit has a fairly poor track record of success. Right? In general, I believe in international politics, and I'll show you data showing this in a moment, that it's a useful rule of thumb is that if you want something from an adversary and they don't want to give it up, either you take it or you don't get it, right? It's not, demanding it usually doesn't work. And finally, this often exploits the element of surprise, a sort of a first mover advantage. And I would emphasize that this is often tactical surprise rather than full strategic surprise. It's rarely a complete mystery that, that, say, China is interested in the territories it claims, or Russia is interested in changing the situation in Ukraine. But the specific moment they attack is usually a surprise. And that, combined with the fact that aims are often limited, it makes this hard to stop at the initial gains from happening, right? They're just trying to see something that's limited. They're trying to get away with it. They get to decide when it happens. It's really hard to sort of stop these at the border, if you will. And that last point about aims being limited, I want to underscore. If you try to take everything, why wouldn't they fight back with everything they have, right? So if you want to sort of avoid the war, you have to aim smaller. And I think that's critical to the strategy. So the way I suggest thinking about this is sort of simple terms, and this is the framework I usually use, is basically taking this distinction, this sort of canonical distinction from Thomas Schelling's Arms and Influence between brute force and coercion. And by the way, if you're going to read any text on strategy, I recommend that you read Schelling's Arms and Influence. And so he distinguishes brute force, where you just sort of defeat the other side utterly and can impose your will, from coercion, where you threaten to inflict pain if they don't give you what you want, and can even succeed bloodlessly through sort of diplomacy, essentially, diplomatic threats. We can understand, if we think back to Crimea, like these are two things Russia could have done, right? You can see them here. But instead, what Russia did was simply to take Crimea. Something that is, I think, clearly different from either of these two other possibilities. And if you'll indulge me, I think sometimes analogies are useful. We can imagine just sort of a simple situation of, hypothetical situation of, a man is walking down the street holding his wallet. He confronts a criminal with a gun who wants the wallet. The criminal could shoot him and take it. He could demand it, sort of threaten to shoot, and get the man with the wallet to agree to give it to him, or he could simply snatch it and calculate that the guy isn't going to challenge an armed criminal with a gun to try to get it back, right? These are three sort of just different ways to get something, to take something. Obviously, there's more room for complexity here, but I find this sort of simple three-part kind of typology useful. So what isn't a fait accompli? I think it's important that we try to avoid stretching this concept into a catch-all for aggression. Here are a bunch of examples of things that I would consider to be coercion. And even with a blockade, which sounds like it's something that's imposed, you're trying to impose pressure on them to get them to give you some concession, right? You're not simply taking that concession. And so I think it's important not to have the fait accompli become a catch-all for various forms of coercive diplomacy or for sort of gray zone operations. I think it has to have a more precise meaning than that. More importantly, I would say, is this question of, would China's conquest of Taiwan be a fait accompli? Would Russia's conquest of Ukraine, if you prefer, be a fait accompli? Same basic question. And this is really where there's disagreement, I think, in Washington and how the term is used. And, are you including, because these are much bigger cases, right? You're talking about taking all of Ukraine versus just Crimea. It's a big difference there. And so my answer is a little bit complicated, but I think it kind of makes sense when you think about it, is that it depends which of the two countries China is challenging you're thinking about, and essentially that China would be using two different strategies, one against Taiwan and one against the United States. So the strategy against Taiwan, I think very clearly not a fait accompli, right? This would be about defeating utterly the Taiwanese military and imposing China's will. That is not, to me, a fait accompli. But it could be a fait accompli against the United States, right? And the idea is that, especially if we imagine Chinese strategies where the goal would be to quickly take Taiwan and minimize or even avoid fighting the United States, and hope that the United States would not then sort of escalate the conflict in Taiwan's defense, right? That would be, I think, a fait accompli strategy. On the other hand, if we imagine China's strategy is to launch sort of maybe a large surprise attack against the United States, places like Kadena and Guam, which is quite plausible, defeat the US military in the region, right? This starts to look more like what I would consider a war-fighting strategy, something that you could call it a limited war strategy if you want. One way to think about this is that starts to look a lot more like Japan's strategy at Pearl Harbor than Russia's in Crimea, and I think we should distinguish the two, right? I don't think Russia's sort of largely bloodless seizure of Crimea and Japan's decision to start the Pacific theater of World War II, other than what was going on in China, should be seen as the same strategy. So that's where I draw the line. Right, so let's look Historically, you can see some examples here, but let me just show you sort of how common each of these are. And so this is data I've collected on how and how often and when and where all over the world countries have acquired or seized pieces of territories by these different sort of confrontational means, right? So this is how revisionist actors like Russia or China, or often much smaller actors, have made territorial gains. Now, importantly, this is only territorial gains, right? There are lots of things that fit these strategies that are not gaining territory, as I mentioned before, that are not on here. So what you're looking at with brute force is this is every attempt, whether failed or successful, to conquer another country outright, right? And what you see is a lot of cases during World War II, but fewer cases since. We have the Korean War, we have the fall of Saigon, and the last time one country tried to conquer another and absorb another outright was the Gulf War in 1990. It's been more than 30 years since anyone has tried to do that, which is at least a relevant fact for thinking about the current situation in Ukraine and the threat to Taiwan as well. Although, as I'll talk about, I wouldn't get too optimistic based on it. Sort of using threats to acquire territory is really remarkably hard to succeed with, much harder than I think at least the political scientists who study this tend to think. There is this interesting cluster of cases right before World War II where this worked. Most famous of these is the Munich crisis, where Hitler's threats succeeded in acquiring the Sudetenland. That's the famous appeasement incident that is coming up right now. But what is by far the most common is this third category, the fait accompli, right? You can see these happen far more often and steadily, and especially in the post-1945 period, they are just much more common. So what these are, what I've set up here is seizing and sort of trying to keep or absorb a piece of another country's territory. That's what you're looking at on the bottom. Let me break this distinction down between seizing whole countries and pieces in a little more detail. And I think this is really important, actually, this chart, for thinking about strategies of aggression. So this is essentially the size of the territories that countries have seized when they've seized territory. And what you can see, and I'm using a very crude measure of the number of provinces they're seizing and how common it is. That last bar on the right is the whole country, right? Regardless of how many provinces it has, just taking the whole country. Those cases of 10 plus provinces, those are your failed attempts to take whole countries, like Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union during World War II. So what you really see is you either go for the whole thing, right? Something like that brute force strategy I mentioned, or you go for a relatively small piece, usually sort of less than a province, as you see here. There are some cases that are in the middle. Some of those are smaller than they look. They're like small parts of 3 provinces, but there are some really important cases there that maybe fall into that limited war framework. Cases like the Arab-Israeli wars, the Iran-Iraq war, cases that are very relevant to this audience. So I don't want to say that these are the only 2 possibilities. Like, there are some important cases in the middle, but on the whole, I think these are the 2 sort of most common strategies. And if I go back, I make a broader argument that really the relationship between conquest and war has changed, right? It used to be that you would start a war, and if you win the war, you get to conquer territory. But much more often now, it's the fait accompli, right? It seize a smaller piece of territory and then try to never fight the war at all. So you might be thinking, okay, there are all these small pieces of territory that are being seized by fait accompli, but they're small, right? Common sense tells us that countries shouldn't fight wars over small things. They just aren't that important. But as much as that makes sense intuitively, historically, I don't think that's actually what we see. And just as 2 examples, these are the 2 sort of most bloody, most deadly clashes. 2 countries that both have nuclear weapons are directly fighting each other. I say directly to leave out things like the Russian pilots, Soviet pilots fighting Americans secretly in the Korean War, for example. So the more important of these examples is when Pakistan in 1999 in the Kargil War sends several thousand of its own forces sort of disguised as insurgents, kind of tactics a little bit like Russia's in Crimea, actually, to seize some hills on India's side of the line of control in Kashmir that overlook an important strategic road. India discovers this, counterattacks, drives them out, nearly 1,000 casualties. We also have the Sino-Soviet border conflict fought not over a few hills, but over a small and basically worthless river island along the Ussuri River, which is the border. You can interpret this as a Chinese attempt to seize the island. There are some interpretations that it was more about sending a message. It's very clear they sent troops to the island and ambushed Russian soldiers coming there, patrolling there. But in general, like, the 2 most bloody sort of incidents we've had between nuclear powers are over, I think, attempts to seize these little tiny territories. So I would not, when you think about places like the Senkakus or the Spratlys, I would not dismiss them just because they're small. And in general, as far as the fait accompli, if I would say the three closest moments any two countries with nuclear weapons have come to war are these two cases, which fortunately didn't involve the United States directly, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, which again began with a Soviet fait accompli of a different kind, right? So I really think this particular strategy is important for the moments in history when we've come closest to nuclear war. So let's look at China's history with the fait accompli, and Russia's, there's a lot of stuff before World War II, but not so much after. So I'll focus on China's here, and I'll leave out some early stuff that happened sort of as or right after the Chinese Civil War ended, things like Tibet. And I'm also going to leave out things that are not seizing territory. So the Korean War is not here. The '79 war with Vietnam is not here. This is not a totally comprehensive list of Chinese aggression or conflicts. But what you see is this war with India, which really is a competitive sort of both sides building posts in this same disputed area, really that produced the recent crisis. Just talked about the Sino-Soviet conflict, starting to seize islands in the South China Sea in 1974 from South Vietnam. And then continuing on in several cases up to the very small case of the Scarborough Shoal in 2012. And then we've seen more action along the border with India since then, as well as Bhutan. But what are some takeaways here? Well, I'll tell you the worst one first, is China came out on top, I would say, at least mostly and usually entirely in all but one of these cases, which is the only one where it took on a stronger country, which was the Soviet Union. And even there, several decades later, Russia did agree to give up the island, right? So China's track record of succeeding at taking territory is much higher than average, much higher than other countries. It's had a lot of success, which is discouraging. The other thing I would say here is that there's a narrative, I think, that's very popular in Washington that China has become sort of clearly more aggressive over time. And I just can't fully buy into that narrative. And it's not because I doubt how aggressively China is behaving. It's because to get more aggressive, you have to have been less aggressive in the past, which implies something about the past that I just don't see, right? China has sort of had, if anything, fought more in its earlier decades, the People's Republic of China, than its later decades. It seized territory fairly steadily throughout its history. I don't necessarily see an upward trend here. So where are we worried about China seizing territory? I think the main sort of path that could potentially lead to war between Japan and China is the Senkaku Islands. Taiwan is, of course, the biggest scenario. And one thing that I couldn't find a map that showed all of this, and this at this point I'm going to mention now, but Taiwan continues to control these small islands of Kinmen and Meizu that are so close to the Chinese mainland, you can't even see them on this map as a separate entity. And that's a real problem for deterrence, as I'll talk about. Nice, juicy target for a fait accompli, unfortunately. Taiwan has the Protus Islands. We don't need to worry about the Paracel Islands or the Scarborough Shoal. China can't seize them because, of course, they already have. And in the Spratlys, China has seized only a minority of the features, and there's a lot of room for more conflict there. And then there's, of course, the possibilities along China's border with India, Bhutan, and perhaps Nepal as well. So this is someone else's data, but just zooming in on the South China Sea, there is this narrative that things have gotten much worse there in recent years, maybe the last 20 years. And we do see, especially the author of this article says since 2007, an escalation in lots of sort of gray zone and coercive activities, threats, warning shots, different things like that. In the South China Sea. But if you look at the dark red lines, which are the military force, usually the territorial seizures, or in other words, the stuff I really care about, the upward trend is less clear. So it's kind of interesting that we see a very clear upward trend in gray zone aggression. We don't see as clear an upward trend in really consequential war-prone aggression. So you can make of that what you will. So what could we imagine happening? So I've looked at every time a country has seized an island or several islands starting in peacetime anywhere in the world in the last 100 years. I found 28 times this has happened. What it tells us is fairly discouraging. It's not unusual for violence to occur, but only one of those cases actually led to war, which was when Argentina seized the Falkland Islands from Britain in 1982. A very interesting case. But other than that, no, has not led to war, which is good in itself, but is troubling for deterrence, as you can imagine. China would have, I think, good historical reasons, both from its own successful seizures and from the general track record historically, to expect that it could get away with seizing islands. And I don't say that with any pleasure. The rate of success for seizing islands is also higher than the rate of success for seizing other territories. It's nearly 70%. Of succeeding here means keeping them, right? So for Taiwan, there's some reason for optimism that it's very rare to conquer whole countries these days. Same thing for Ukraine, as I said. But when you look at the cases, like, for example, the two other places that were divided, took what was previously one country and divided it based on Cold War ideological politics, right? Vietnam and South Korea, those are two of the other cases. And in general, even like Saddam Hussein's rhetoric about Kuwait, right? This should really, historically, is part of our territory. It should be part of our territory. There's rumblings even in Russia about Ukraine being sort of kind of rightfully part of Ukraine. They're really Russians, that sort of thing. There's cause for concern here. But I would still say that, that we really need to also bear in mind this more common scenario of the fait accompli seizing either Kinmen and Meizu, those islands right off the coast of China that I mentioned, or Itu Aba, which is the largest of the Spratly Islands. I'll show you that on a map in a minute. And I really think that scenario, like, this would just put Taiwan and the United States in such a difficult position if China started sort of a campaign against them by seizing just these areas. And would Taiwan really want to fight over such unfavorable terrain? Would the United States? Be a really hard strategic problem. And finally, there's lots of potential for conflicts between China and India in the future. I think this is just outright likely to happen, that we will see more territorial grabs along the Himalayas. So historically, about half of the territorial faits accomplis, so faits accomplis seizing territory, succeeded initially, and maybe 40% succeeded in the long run. The most common way they failed is you take territory from a state, that state fights back and takes it back, right? Pretty simple. So there are lots of successes for defenders here, lots of cases where the defender takes back the territory historically. But at the same time, it's important to note that most faits accomplis endure if they're not quickly reversed. And there are some successes for diplomacy, whether international or bilateral, but on the whole, military outcomes are more common. And overall, we see about 15% of faits accomplis seizing territory provoked war, which I think is consistent with this idea that it's a calculated risk of war, an expectation that you're going to avoid it, but an understanding that there is some risk, and certainly more than half involved at least one death. So if we look, this is every interstate war, meaning I'm leaving out purely civil wars since Vietnam. And I've divided it, sort of keeping with this theme, by seizing territory, conquest, if you will, or not. And we see a lot of wars still starting with seizing territory, which is the point of this first column. And I've highlighted the ones that I think are the fait accompli strategy. There are a few others where other strategies, I think, for example, the Armenia-Azerbaijan case it was clear that Azerbaijan intended to start a war and win that war, right? It goes beyond, to me, the fait accompli strategy. We see some secession conflicts. We see some conflicts on the right over either foreign imposed regime change, usually with the US as the agent there, or interventions in internationalized civil wars that sometimes get included on this list. But let me highlight, so about a third, I would say, of wars in recent decades started with this sort of miscalculated attempt to get away with seizing a piece of territory. And you could definitely include the Gulf War on that list. So it's quite important, but let me show you in blue, which wars the US has fought in. It's a pretty different list of wars. It's interesting how there have been a lot of fait accompli wars, a lot of wars the US has been part of, but they've largely been different wars. And maybe that will continue. I think this is partly why the strategy was so underappreciated, at least until 2014 in the United States. But when you look at the threats from Russia and China to US allies, I'm not so optimistic that these two sets of cases will stay separate. So deterring faits accomplis, what I found doing some statistical analysis is that the military balance, believe it or not, is not an especially strong predictor of when and where they happen, but it's a better predictor of who wins once they happen, right? So you often do, especially when they lead to fighting, you see the stronger side come out on top. But it's not the case that strong countries sort of very consistently take territory from weaker countries. It's often countries at similar power levels. But I think this also reflects the fact that this is a politico-military strategy where it is above all about the political calculation of what you can get away with taking, not just the military calculation of who would win a major war. After all, your whole plan is to not fight that war, if this is the strategy you're using. So I would argue in terms of what works for deterrence, I would single out tripwires as something that is very effective, right? This is where you just forward deploy troops into a vulnerable area and those troops would have to be attacked to take it. US partner and ally tripwires can be helpful, but of course US tripwires with actual US forces are gonna account for the most. You can think about how the heck did the United States keep the Soviet Union out of the indefensible enclave of West Berlin for decades, right? It was tripwires. I like to point out that there have been US forces in South Korea for all but one of the last more than 75 years. There was 1 year when there were only advisors there. That is the only year in which North Korea invaded. I don't think that's an accident. I do think that this is a fairly effective tactic. And if we look around the world, I think in the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, we see tripwires playing a really vital role. The absence of them in Ukraine and Georgia is part of why we worry so much about those places. Turning to the Pacific, it's impossible for India to block every possible Chinese encroachment. With Japan, there are no Japanese forces in the Senkakus, which makes it different from the Spratlys, which is a real cause for concern. But if you really want evidence that tripwires matter, look at this. So I know this is probably a little hard to see, but this is the holdings right now in the Spratly Islands. The Chinese ones are in the dark red. And what you see is that it just seems to make no geographic sense, right? They're near each other, they're interspersed. China is, of course, off to the top to the north. But we don't see China only having the most northern territories. There doesn't seem to be any political or strategic logic to this. What happened here is that as these different countries came in, certain places were already taken. So they started taking smaller and smaller islands that were still within the areas they claimed, which for China is all of this, but not for some of the others, and where they could sort of take it bloodlessly. And that's mostly what happened, and that's why China has some of the smaller islands, which is probably why they reclaimed land to build up military bases there, right? So you see even these tiny little posts were successful deterrents, is the point I'm making here. As I already mentioned, the military force is usually what, unfortunately, has to reverse the fait accompli. You can see some examples of that succeeding and failing here. Point that I think is especially important for this audience, and I really want to emphasize this, is that historically it is more common to eject the invading force after it seizes its objective. So like they do seize their objective, but then you mobilize forces elsewhere and then come back and take it back from them, than it is to stop them short of their objective. There are cases of both. It's not as if one, it has to be one or the other, but there are lots and lots of precedents for the aggressor taking the territory and then coming in later and kicking them back out. And this is true both for the sort of typical fait accompli cases of sort of province or less, but also those sort of your ally is taken and that's a fait accompli from your perspective cases that we've also been talking about. And I think this is important in the Baltics, where there's kind of this temptation to imagine that Russia could seize these areas and these three sort of close the Suwalki Gap, seize Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and then sort of somehow engineer the war ending there, as opposed to allowing NATO to mobilize and take them back in a limited war. And I just don't think history supports that assumption. All right, there's also this interesting possibility. In the interest of time, I won't go into this too much, but sometimes you see, and India did this a little bit near Trishul, but you see if they seize one area, you just seize a different area that they haven't, that is empty in the disputed region, and then both sides have seized territory, and neither side is clearly the loser. This can be a way to sort of prosecute the crisis bloodlessly. It can be a clever tactic in some circumstances. All right, so third-party interventions, and this is important. So basically you have, like, if we talk about the Senkaku Islands, you have the first two parties are China and Japan, right? If we imagine China seizing them. The third party is the United States. So basically this is what do countries in the position of the United States in all these conflicts do historically. That's what I'm talking about here. And what I found is that when you're talking about the conquest of a whole country, there is a fairly high rate of intervention, right? Both of the world wars started with German invasions of one of these countries, Poland and Belgium respectively, leading to larger interventions by other great powers. We see the US intervening in the Korean War and in the Gulf War. But when you're talking about anything that is smaller, those smaller sort of parts of states, it's really discouraging what history says from a deterrent standpoint. So of those 28 times anyone seized an island in peacetime, even though half of them led to shooting, none of them led to another country getting involved in shooting, firing its own shots. And not once, to my knowledge, has the United States ever fired a shot to defend an ally or really any country when someone has seized just a piece of their territory, right? Something less than the whole country. You just don't see that historically. Which, again, kind of interesting that it's at least important to understand this track record, that what the United States is trying to do here is actually not something it's usually tried to do, something that is unusual from a global perspective and that is probably difficult. So causes, as I start to sort of wrap up here, what causes the fait accompli? What predictors are there? The most important thing, I think, is false optimism. So believing you could get away with seizing the territory. Maybe I should just say optimism, but it's false when you're wrong. And in general, I often teach a class called Causes of War, and I tell students the most important cause of war is false optimism, thinking the war is going to go better than it actually will. That could mean thinking you could get away with seizing a piece of territory, or underestimating who's going to get involved, or just imagining it will be a short and low-cost war. There are various forms of it, but this is really, these mistaken beliefs that you can get away with something or that you'll win at something are really important. The next point I want to make is that it's really surprisingly common to see fights over places that you wouldn't think are worth it. There's a great quote that the Falklands War was like two bald men fighting over a comb. And that's actually very common, unfortunately. If you sort of look at the Senkaku Islands, you don't really see resources, you don't really see crucial strategic value, and you just it would be reasonable to think like, there's no cause for war here. But what I'm telling you is that countries do often seize these exact types of places and sometimes fight wars over them, historically. It's hard to understand, but it's just empirically, factually true that this happens. And I think it's important to avoid an analytical trap of squinting at these small territories until you kind of imagine that they're crucial for some purpose. Maybe there's oil around the Spratly Islands, or sea lines of communication, as if you can't control them with submarines and air power without the islands, that sort of thing. So avoid that analytical trap. The last thing I'll say is that given that the material value of a lot of these territories is not very impressive, we have to look more to kind of nationalism and domestic politics for motives sometimes. And it's more about being seen to seize territory from an adversary than it is about what's in the territory itself in a lot of these cases that we have to worry about. You also, I think, looking within governments, often see that the frontline sort of unit and theater commanders are actually often people in some of these mostly autocratic regimes that are really the ones pushing for seizing territory, or in a few cases, and this probably isn't relevant to Russia and China, just doing it on their own. Okay, so let me wrap up by talking about the situation in Ukraine. And let me just acknowledge here that I don't have a crystal ball about what Putin's strategy is, but we can kind of think about the options from the perspective that Russia has of what I've been talking about. Think about coercive diplomacy, although, as I've said, it's often surprisingly hard to actually make real gains by coercive diplomacy. And this sort of nebulous nature of Russia's demands, sort of a list of demands, some of which are clear, some of which are not, some of which are almost impossible to imagine being granted, some of which are really not that big of asks. It's not conducive to actually getting something that is of value to Russia. It's a very odd approach to coercive diplomacy, enough so that it makes you wonder whether something else isn't going on than Russia trying to actually get concessions from NATO or Ukraine. So there are possibilities for a fait accompli. You could have an annexation of the Donbass separatist regions, or you could have, I think somewhat more likely, a recognition of their independence, even though that's not on the slide. You could imagine an expansion of their current territory by seizing more territory, some of the cities perhaps in eastern Ukraine. This option number 3 is what's most common historically and globally, not a prediction that it will happen here at all, but that's worth noting, whereas annexations, interestingly, are really rare. Because usually the problem with annexation is that you're admitting it wasn't yours already. So usually what countries do when they seize territory is they don't annex it because they say, this was already our territory, why would we have to annex it? It's almost an admission of illegitimacy to annex territory. But of course, Russia did annex Crimea, so it's possible here. There are also the really serious, even more serious possibilities of a conquest of Ukraine, which again, I've talked about, are generally rare, but I wouldn't be too optimistic based on that. There's also the possibility of foreign imposed regime change in Ukraine. And all I'll add here is that there is an impressive and growing academic literature that shows that the successes after World War II, notwithstanding in places like Germany and Japan, the success rate of really anyone, not just the United States, occupying a country, changing the regime, and getting a good outcome is really low. It's really hard to do. Like, these new regimes, the populations don't like you. The leaders are under intense pressure to show that they're independent. They're often unstable and weak states, right? It's really hard to succeed with regime change, but that doesn't mean Putin won't try. And then there are possibilities that maybe look a little bit more like Georgia in 2008 of sort of attrition or just sending a message, not actually trying to accomplish any of these. So anyway, hopefully the facts I've shared with you today are helpful for thinking through some of these options. And hopefully, well, from a personal perspective, hopefully we will see none of them actually happen. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Altman. You mentioned earlier in your talk that the relationship between conquest and war has changed. What do you see as the conditions of this? And do you see an environment where this could change and go back to pre-1945 order?
Yeah. So it's the hard part of the question is, so we generally see countries still seizing territory, but doing it in ways that have a lower risk of war and that create smaller wars when they happen after 1945, and that's become more true over time. Although it's potentially starting, the last few years have not been good from a conquest perspective. There's been more, so maybe those trends are reversing. Exactly why that is really hard because so many things changed about the world. US foreign policy changed, the structure of the international system changed, lots of new international organizations and laws, nuclear weapons came about. So it's really hard to know what caused these big change after World War II because there are actually 10 to 15 different causes that all happened at the same time. We can't tell them apart. So I spent a lot of time working on that, and it's just really hard to tell them apart. But one possibility that's worth noting is that this is about US power, US foreign policy. The US is a stabilizing actor in the world, conditional on it being the strongest actor in the world. And it's interesting that we kind of see, although actually the 90s have a lot of faits accomplis, a lot of conquest, we see the lowest point of it is kind of 2000 up to 2013, which is consistent with a period of sort of US hegemony, if you will, or close to it in the world, I would say, unipolarity if you prefer. And the other period when the US was perhaps at its strongest are the years initially after World War II as the Soviet Union is kind of recovering. And that's also a period where we see somewhat less of this globally. But so it's possible that the sort of relative decline of the United States, if we see a rise of China and others, could sort of weaken the US's ability to act as a constraint against all this. But honestly, I don't think we know for sure.
Thank you, Dr. Altman. You discussed earlier there seems to be a contradiction between the ineffectiveness of forward defense and the effectiveness of tripwire forces. Could you just discuss that nuance in a little more detail?
So yeah, so I'm not arguing that tripwires are more effective than forward defense. I'm arguing that tripwires are often effective for deterrence, even though they're cheap, and that forward defense, I mean, just imagine like putting enough troops in the South China Sea to actually stop China from ever, even by surprise, being able to seize additional islands. The force requirements for that are unsustainable. It's largely infeasible. My point was that you don't need to, right? If they're determined to do it, even despite tripwires, right? If deterrence is the usual ways of achieving deterrence are not going to work, right? It's good enough to just be able to come in and retake them later. You don't actually have to stop them in the act. So hopefully that clarified. But I definitely don't want to claim that a small tripwire is a better deterrent than a larger or capable force. I do not believe that. That makes no sense. That is not the case.
So I had a question for you over here. In a sense, isn't building islands in the South China Sea a fait accompli? They're building their own territory there. So that's my first question. And I'm just curious if you're familiar with the concept of the poison frog, which is the idea of deterrence where you can grab the territory, but we're signaling in advance that the consequences of you grabbing that territory are going to be extremely painful. So it could be tripwires, but it also could be telegraphing some severe other consequences using other elements of national power.
Yeah, so one of the explanations, I've not heard the poison frog phrase before, so I'll look that up. But I have heard that argument before. And I mean, one of the arguments about why conquest is rarer is that it's about nationalism leading to more resistance in places like cities. And that the costs of insurgency are just so high now, but there are also technological reasons for that, like IEDs, that conquest no longer pays. It's maybe. It's hard to know, as I said. So much changed around the same period of time after World War II. Nationalism, of course, started well before World War II. So, can you deter conquest by, I think is the other part of the question, can you deter conquest by sort of maximizing resistance in the region? I think that there could be something to that, and you see certain countries have adopted that strategy historically, like I believe Yugoslavia during the Cold War, for example, perhaps Switzerland. It's just the actual territories generally that have been seized in the period I studied, the last 75 years, are usually too small for that to really come into play. You don't have the urban warfare absolutely happens, but it happens in civil wars and in interventions in civil wars, counterinsurgencies. There have not been a lot of high intensity, just purely interstate, state on state, kind of World War II style battles in those environments. So I think that's why it's hard to give you a definitive answer. And then in the South China Sea, what I was trying to do is be careful about how we use the term fait accompli. So you actually have to like take or impose something that meaningfully changes the situation in a way that benefits you, right? Just sort of sending a message to the other side or making a demand or anything you can announce verbally, I think really doesn't qualify, right? You have to actually take something or create new facts on the ground that are in your favor. So I would certainly seizing territory would count. I would include like reclaiming land to build up your existing territories as a smaller, lesser form of fait accompli. But almost anything you're doing with ships, I probably would not count, if that might be a crude way to put it.
Do we have any other questions from the room? Sorry, ma'am, I couldn't see you behind my monitor. My final question, I know you addressed it in the base talk, but is there a special form of deterrence or special deterrence measures that that work especially well against fait accompli, or is it just standard deterrence kind of measures?
So I think the problem with the fait accompli is that you can have effective deterrence against big attacks and still fail at deterrence against the fait accompli, which is partly why I think deploying tripwires to vulnerable areas is important. I think it's somewhat tragic that Japan hasn't had a small amount of troops in the Senkaku Islands for decades now. Would have been very easy to do when China was weaker. Now it would be more of a crisis-inducing event. I think that was a mistake. So you also sometimes historically, creating West Berlin was a mistake. It created a very tempting target for a Soviet fait accompli that fortunately they never tried. And that could have been avoided with better diplomacy during World War II. So trying to, I would say understanding that it's a harder problem than regular deterrence is the first thing. Understanding the role of tripwires and countering it. And then, of course, making sure that you do need the actual military power to credibly threaten to reverse the fait accompli. I don't believe you need to actually stop them from taking the area they want, but they need to at least believe you can take it back, right? That does matter as well. And that starts to look a lot like typical deterrence, right? Fair enough.
All right. Any further questions? All right. Thank you, Dr. Altman.
Thank you.